So tonight we are offering Understanding Soils, a Key to Stewardship, Land Health, and Climate Resiliency. And it's presented by Kip Kolesinskas, who is a conservation scientist. He is the man, the myth, the legend, and he is certainly an expert. So I will give you a brief bio on Kip's extensive work. Kip's major clients include American Farmland Trust, Connecticut Department of Agriculture, US, CFT, North Central Conservation District, and the University of Connecticut Extension. Kip is also the co-chair of Working Lands Alliance and a member of the Connecticut Council on Environmental Equality. Much of his recent work has been focused on improved efforts for land access and affordability, and he also provides technical services to new and beginning farmers. He served on the Yukon Extension Solid Ground Farmer Training Program, where he was involved in land access, soil health, climate change adaptation strategies, probably anything else because he is the man. In addition, he works for AFT's, American Farmland Trust, national initiatives for farms under threat, Farmland for the Next Generation, and climate change initiatives. Kip is a recognized and national speaker on soils, land use planning, farmland protection, climate change adoption, and farmland access. In addition to his wealth of professional experience, he is an avid fisherman, cook. I hear he makes a really good pie, which is hard to do, and a gardener and local foods advocate. I've known Kip for a few years. I don't know how he finds the time in the day. And with that, I will turn it over to Kip for his presentation and welcome in a few more people to the presentation.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the very nice introduction. So I appreciate that, Brianna. I'm a soil scientist and love everything about soil. So, and obviously you want to learn more about soils, or maybe you're soils junkies as well. So on this opening slide, you can see here of a nice soil landscape out in Western Connecticut. So I would say one of those things, and some of you I know are new to Connecticut, some of you grew up in Connecticut, maybe multi-generations in Connecticut, and I would say Connecticut soils get a bad rap. You know, everybody talks about how stony and rocky they are, and that, oh, all the farmers left and went west, and that's why everything went back to forest. The reality is that it's much more complicated than that. Obviously, you know, the opening up of the West, the Industrial Revolution, the kind of the norms of succession planning between generations all had as much to do with it as the soil resources. And though we all know Connecticut has a lot of different nicknames, you know, we hear of it as the Nutmeg State, the Constitution State, the Land of Steady Habits. But my favorite is the Provision State. And the reason of the Provision State is during the American Revolution, it was the agricultural products and some of the industrial products of Connecticut that really helped win the Revolutionary War because of the productivity of Connecticut farms and farmers and farmland. So there, for those that think our soils are all terrible. And then, of course, we have to acknowledge that, you know, long before the colonists were here, that there were native people that were farming here for thousands of years and managing the landscape. So, you know, some of the tribes were the Pequots, Mohegans, the Nipmunks, the Pagussets, the Chodacokes, Mattabessetts, Quinnipiacs, and the Podunks. And archaeologists and historians and the tribes would say that because of the productivity of the soils in Connecticut's valleys and along the shoreline, and because of the anadromous fisheries and marine fisheries of Long Island Sound, that there was probably the highest density of native people in Connecticut when Adrian Block came up here in 1614 up the Connecticut River. So, and of course, native people are still here and are still farming the landscape today. So we certainly want to acknowledge that. And so, you know, it didn't take a brilliant colonist to see where some of the best agricultural land was, even though unfortunately many native people died of European diseases. They could still see the legacy of the lands that were farmed and the excellent soils in Connecticut's river valleys and along its coast. So we're going to build on that and talk more about soils. And hopefully that will help you with your soil questions. So let's go through a short presentation here about Connecticut soil, so we have some common vocabulary and common understanding. Next slide. So here's some possible topics for conversations when we get to the Q&A section. What kinds of soils are in Connecticut? Where can I learn more about my soils? What the heck is with soil health? What's being done to protect soils? What role do soils play in climate change? What can I do to protect and improve my soils? So next slide. So just an overview. Now let's think of this apple as the earth. Next. Represents the earth. Next. So cut out and save. Next. A quarter of the apple. Next. So that represents the land area. Next. Now cut that slice in half. Keep one piece. Next. This represents where people live. Next. Cut that piece in quarters. Keep a quarter of that. This represents the amount of soil where food can be grown, because we know there are some areas that are too wet or too cold or too dry to grow food. Next. So that is only 3% or 1/32 of the Earth's surface. That's that thin skin of the Earth, no more than 2 meters deep, that's capable of growing the food that we need. And there are a lot of pressures on that same land. So it is a very finite resource and deserving of better protection than it currently gets, which of course is one of the things that I love about Connecticut Farmland Trust, because their mission is protecting our best farmland soils, which provide a lot of different ecosystem services. So why do we study soil? So again, it's a medium for all kinds of plant growth, including food and fiber, producer and absorber of gases. There's an exchange between the soil and the atmosphere. It's home to organisms, so that producer and absorber of gases, home to organisms. When you hear people talk about soil's ability to store carbon in the ground, organic matter, carbon, soils are great at that. It's a snapshot of our history. It breaks down wastes. It's a sort of construction material, and it serves a really important role in filtering water and waste and recharging aquifers. Next. So there are what we consider as soil scientists 5 soil forming factors. That's what makes different soils different. So biota, so what kind of critters live on or in the soil? The topography, are you at the top of a slope or the bottom of the slope? The climate, of course, we're kind of a humid climate here, cool, humid climate. And then those factors over time. Are you here in Connecticut, where the soils are only about 17,000 years old? Or are you in, the Piedmont in the US or in Australia, where the soils are millions of years old? So that all impacts what our soils look like and what their physical and chemical properties are like. And the parent material, and did it form in sand and gravel? Did it form from schist bedrock? That all influences it. Next. So, and as soil scientists, we look at very specific physical and chemical properties to help us determine the potential uses of different soils and what their properties are. So the color, is it gray? Is it orange? Is it red? The texture, how sandy, silty, or clay. The structure, how the pieces form together into little clumps, particularly when you see the topsoil and it looks like cookie crumbs or cake crumbs. That's the soil structure. The consistence, how hard is it? The amount of roots and pores and how far down in the soil that they go. And then other features such as depth to bedrock, depth to a water table, the slope. All of those kinds of things influence the soils and how we might use them. Next. And so just an example, people are familiar with the concept of soil texture. People talk about sand, silt, and clay. We have a sandy soil, or you're going to try to buy some topsoil and they're going to sell you loam or loam. And though the soil texture under USDA definitions relates to very specific soil particles of a certain size and very specific percentages. So most of Connecticut's soils are dominantly a sandy loam texture. So if you go across for the percentage of clay and up for the percentage of sand and down for the percentage of silt, you can see the kind of percentages that make up a sandy loam or a loam or a silt loam. Everybody thinks that they have clay, but there's actually very few clay soils in Connecticut. Most of our soils are a sandy loam texture. Next, and that's important to know the texture, because a sandy or gravelly soil doesn't hold much water for plants. So you might have to irrigate more, and it doesn't hold nutrients very well. So you might have to fertilize more. And silty soils or clay soils hold a lot of moisture. And though if you run equipment on them and trample them, they can compact, which makes it very hard for roots to grow. And they also can erode very easily if they're on a slope. So that's why texture is important. Next. So, and again, the landscape position. Obviously here where we get, somewhere between 43 and 58 inches of precipitation, there's a lot of water on the landscape. So if you're up on the top of the slope, it's probably going to be a drier soil than if you're down at the bottom of the slope. So that's really important, the landscape position as well. Next. And so this is all the same kind of parent material. All these soils formed in the same stuff, kind of a sandy loam texture laid down by the glacier of material, but they look quite different because one's at the top of the slope where it's very dry, and one is at the bottom of the slope, the toe slope, which is very wet. So we would map all of those and consider those as different soils with different physical and chemical properties and potential for different uses. Next. And here's little Connecticut. We've got 3.5 million people on 3.2 million acres. So you're thinking, well, how complex can the soils be in a little state like Connecticut? Next. So here's a typical landscape here in eastern Connecticut. Next. So now we're gonna take you to your earth science class in what, 9th grade earth science here. So we're gonna go through in kind of a geologic timetable here of what happened on Connecticut's landscapes that influenced the parent materials or the stuff that our soils formed in with those 5 soil forming factors that we talked about. So here we are in the dinosaur era, Triassic, Jurassic time frame, 250 million years ago. Dinosaurs were running around. Pangea, the supercontinent, was breaking up. Connecticut and Africa separated, and a huge crack formed in the Connecticut River Valley or Rift Valley with volcanic mountain ranges on both sides. Next. So then about 1 million years ago, glaciation started in the Northern Hemisphere, and the last glacier retreated in Connecticut about 17,000 years ago. So there was over 1 mile thick of ice over all of Connecticut. And then you can imagine as that melted, big chunks of ice got buried. There were huge meltwater deposits of soil material that got washed over and got rounded off in layers of sand and gravel, and glacial lakes that formed and silt and clay deposited in those. So that all happened over from 350 million years ago to about 17,000 years ago. Next. And then as we see, you were next to the glacial front, there were, there was permafrost, there were woolly mammoths running around. Keep going, 13,000, 10,000, starting to look a little bit more like what we would expect. Next, 8,000, roughly between 8 and 10,000. We don't necessarily know exactly when Native people got here around the edge of the glacier. We think somewhere around then. They started managing the landscape. Next. 6,000 years ago, they're really starting to manage the landscape. They're using fire, they're coppicing different plant materials, they're gathering soil, different crops. Next. And 4,000 years ago, really highly managed landscape by native people. Next. 400 years ago, oh, the colonists showed up. So we think probably corn, beans, and squash came a little over 1,000 years ago to New England and to Connecticut. Colonists came here, started cutting everything down, and by the late 1800s, probably 75 to 80% of all Connecticut was cleared and used for some form of agriculture. So all of these influences, and probably the bedrock, the glaciation, and then the human influence have had a huge impact on our soils, on what they look like today. Next. And then here we are today, where all of that cleared land has reverted back to forest, or is in urban suburban development, or in farmland. So we only have about 14% of our landscape in Connecticut is in agriculture. So this is a map of all the different parent materials. So parent material is, again, the stuff that the soils have formed in. So and on the bottom right, you can see the kind of different names of glacial till, glacial outwash. That's the parent material, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But Connecticut, as a result of all that, has one of the most complex soil landscapes in the country. So in a 5-acre field, you may have 2 or 3 different soils with completely different physical and chemical properties. So it can be very challenging to manage. And for soil scientists, very difficult to map and to understand what's going on. But that's part of what we love. Next. And hopefully why you're here. So here are some of our basic parent materials that our soils formed. So there's glacial till, which is basically stuff that the glacier, all the rocks and soil before that the glacier ground up, kind of either pushed in front of it and rode over the top of it in some places. Next. Glacial fluvial or glacial outwash. So again, you think these huge torrents of meltwater as the glacier melted, going through our river valleys and laying down sand and gravel, and then wind blowing sand and silt over on top of it. So those are our glacial fluvial materials dominant in our valleys. Next. And then our more recent soils in our floodplains, those are where rivers and streams overflow, and they deposit soil material. That dark stuff that you see in the lower part of this, what we call a soil profile, if you look from the surface down, that's what we call it. That's actually an old buried surface layer. That was the topsoil at one point in time. The river changed course and deposited about 3 feet of silt and sand on top of that. And we have a new topsoil forming at the top of that soil profile. Next. Oh, and by the way, down at the bottom, the Citico, Hadley, that's the soil series. That's a part of our soil classification. Just like the bug people and the plant people, soil scientists have a classification system. That's at our lowest level of classification that tells us the most about the soil. So where we had glacial lakes, there was a huge glacial lake that formed in Rocky Hill, Glastonbury, that went all the way up to Vermont and New Hampshire. And then there were some smaller glacial lakes in the Middletown area and a few other spots around the state. So there, when you think about the ice on top of a lake and the silts and sands would settle out, silt and clay would settle out in the wintertime. And when those drained, we have silty and clay soils that formed in those deposits in those old glacial lakes. Next. Organic parent material, again, you had these shallow lakes where icebergs were buried, maybe where beaver meadows, where beavers flooded the landscape and were just rotted because it's anaerobic, rotted organic matter built up from sphagnum moss, from trees falling over, from brush, from reeds. And those are very rich in organic matter. Those are organic soils. Next. And then, our human influence, anthropic or anthropogenic soils. Those are soils that have been influenced by humans. So where we're cutting and filling the landscape if it supports plants, we call that soil material. And so that's a huge influence. It's not unusual for almost any piece of property that I go out on that I don't see some influence of humans on that piece of property. And then the only other one that I do not have a slide for here, but I need to get one, is subaqueous soils, that we actually can map and identify soils underwater. So if you get light penetration down to the bottom, there are plants that grow and root themselves in the bottom. Think of eelgrass in Long Island Sound, think of lily pads in a shallow pond or lake. And there are actually soils and soil properties that we can identify and interpret for different uses, such as, is it going to be suitable for oyster production or moorings for boats? Next. So again, I mentioned that we have a classification system, and the whole purpose of a classification system is, again, to really be able to identify different soils, their properties, understand how they might be used by us, or what ecosystem services they might provide. And then also, can we map them so to show you where different soils are, so you can make a decision about land use. Next. So when you dig a hole in the ground, what you're really looking at is a soil pedon. And that's part of a larger area of similar soils, which we call a polypedon. And then that's all part of a landscape. So there are all different soils on landscapes. So what soil scientists try to do is to map those out. Next. So we make soil maps. And we have soil maps for over 90% of all private lands in the United States that are available to you free of charge. And they're going to drop in the chat access to, next slide. Oh, here's some soil scientists doing mapping. Next, the Web Soil Survey. So we've digitized all the soil maps for Connecticut as seamless coverage, and they're available to you. If you can put in an address or the closest address, you can generate a soil map and different interpretations that can tell you the suitability of that soil for different uses. Next. So here's a picture of a soil map with some of the soil names. Next. And then description of their different properties and qualities. Next. And here's a map that I made of the land capability class, so it's suitability for agriculture. Next. Yeah, and Brianna's dropping in USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is the keeper of soils information across the country. And so there's actually a document that's called the Soil Survey of Connecticut, which has a lot more information than is even available through the Web Soil Survey, but you could get it and look at it through that NRCS Connecticut link. So let's just talk a little bit briefly about climate change and soils, the importance of soils for climate change. So we know that our climate is changing, that it's getting hotter. We're going to have dry periods. We're going to have heavy precipitation like we did last night, less snow in the winter, warmer winters. So how does that impact our soils? How does that impact agriculture? And what soils are most resilient to that? How can we manage our soils for climate change? Next. So how are farmers and gardeners adapting? They're managing their risk. They're diversifying their operations and the crops and products that they raise and grow. They're using conservation practices like cover crops and farming across slope, newly adopted production systems like high tunnels and greenhouses. And you'll see here improvements to soil health. So what is soil health? Next. So, and these are some ways we can manage soil health by managing our nutrients. And Brianna's going to drop in there that I always recommend people do a soil test. Every couple of years, you should do a soil test for your fields or your gardens. That gives you a baseline to work with as far as the nutrient status. Make sure you're not applying too little or too much. Managing your irrigation, how much water you're putting on the soil, the amount of organic matter or humus in the soil, because that's really important when we have these dry spells. So for every 1% of organic matter that you can increase in your soil, that can hold another inch of water for your plants. And then erosion control, because of these more intense rainfall events, you're more likely to get erosion on bare soil. So we really need to manage the amount of bare soil that we have. Next. So the definition is continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living system that sustains plants, animals, and human health for current and future generations. And soil health and soil quality is also a function of what it is that you're interested in using the soil for, and for what kind of ecosystem that it's supporting. Again, if you're interested in forest management, you would need to manage soil health differently for forest soils than you would for something that's intensively used for vegetable production. So it's a function of kind of what the land use and land cover and the intended use is. Next. So what we were talking about earlier with are the inherent soil properties. So those are like the bones and the guts and the arteries of the soils, and the dynamic soil properties is the makeup and the clothes. So those are things that you can change, much easier to change. The amount of organic matter, the soil fertility, the reaction, how you manage it. So that's something you have more control over. If you have a really clay or a really sandy soil, that's really tough to change. Next. And they're going to drop a couple of things too on soil health from NRCS. Have a great soil health website. So some things you want to do: you want to minimize disturbance to soil, maximize the diversity of different plants in a rotation in your garden, in a field, keep living roots in the soil, keep that soil covered with plants or plant residues, and manage your nutrients carefully and create the best habitat for the soil food web, all those critters that live in the soil. Next. And then soil landscapes and climate change. Again, as I said, with CFT, they're really working hard to protect our best soils, prime farmland soils, or soils that have the physical and chemical properties that not only are you capable of growing and raising about anything on them, they're really the most resilient to the impacts of climate change, because they're well drained, they have a texture that holds moisture, they're not too wet, they're not too dry. We need to protect our groundwater recharge areas, our wetlands and watercourses, protect a variety of soil landscapes, except those that go across the valley. So that way plants and critters can migrate from one part of the landscape to another part of the landscape. Understand the soils on your property and your community, and where possible, because of these short-term droughts, try to capture any extra ground and surface water. Next. So gave you a soil science 101, and I don't know what, Brianna, 15 minutes, 10 minutes. So anybody have any questions about what I covered, or questions that have been burning in your mind about soils?
I do have a question before anyone else. I'm going to throw up a poll here. And if you could just click to say what hat you're wearing tonight. I'm sure a few of you might be more than one.
Which is fine. And maybe you're not in the soils groupie junkie category yet, but that's something to strive for, as well as a CFT supporter.
Leave it up for another few moments.
Okay.
What if everyone was a soils groupie?
Well, then probably we would have better managed soils, and we wouldn't be so casual about how we use our soil resources.
Things we can aspire to.
That's right.
Okay. Well, I'll end the polling. It looks like most people here are farmers.
Okay.
Land trust staff or board members, or non-farming individuals.
Okay. Excellent.
One junkie.
Okay. Very good.
So you should
Thank
probably
you.
see that on your screens now.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll stop that. And
Okay. Any burning questions about what I've covered, or something you'd like a little more detail on?
Please do go ahead, feel free to unmute yourself, just throw out a question or type it in the chat if you prefer that medium.
Soil health.
Sure. Hi, Ross.
That's a new term, say, in the last 10 or 15, 20 years.
It is. Yeah. And it's interesting that, and I think that I'm not, and probably more of it came out of from the agronomists, the plant people than really the soil people talking about soil health. And I would say, you know, some of it might relate to our interest in human health, that maybe of getting to get people to relate to soils, of talking about soil health. And I think that it's also a way to think holistically about it. You know, for example, in the Midwest, they probably did a pretty good job of managing soils for erosion control by converting to, you know, no-till, and you know, they did drainage because of wetness. And though they still found that there were issues, for instance, they were still getting a lot of groundwater that was contaminated by nutrients. It's because they weren't paying enough attention to the soil fertility. So it's a more holistic way of looking at soils, that you're thinking about, because it's a living biological system, rather than thinking of it as just, oh, it's sand, silt, and clay, and we're gonna, you know, put a lot of fertilizer and pesticide on it, and we're gonna plant it, and things are gonna grow forever. And we realize that that over time, if things are not managed more holistically, that your yields start to decline, or there are off-site impacts to soils that are not well managed, such as degraded water quality in streams or in groundwater, or you know, you start to get compaction, you start to get more pest and disease problems. So it's a more holistic, but that's a good observation that's fairly recently. And before that, we talked about soil quality, and now we talk about soil health. Brianna?
So you brought up something that made me think about morals and reconciliation in soils. I won't say what town I live in, but there is a farm that it was not preserved.
Right.
And it is being actively carved up for soil mining. It's very visible. It's heartbreaking as someone who works for a land trust. You know, folks have to do what they have to do, but that was pretty devastating to see. But how can that be done sustainably? And I ask that as someone that I look at my backyard and I think I have to go down to Ace Hardware and get a ton of soil to fill in my yard, fill in my garden. How do we reconcile soil mining with sustainable soil that we can use, whether you're a farmer or a backyard hobbyist?
Yeah. Well, right. So of course, you know, we live in a country where there are private property rights, and if people have, you know, the planning and zoning and wetlands approvals and permits, there's a lot of things that they can do. Of course, what I would like is that people make well-informed decisions, and that they understand all the choices that they have, such as the fact that there is farmland preservation, that it's important to protect our best soil resources because they are very finite. So does it make sense if you are a landowner and you need income, you know, to sell off your topsoil, or could you perhaps sell a conservation easement and have that continue to be in agriculture? So I want to make sure people have all their options. I think it's really important that we do as much reuse of things as possible. So for instance, you know, I think that you know, compost is an excellent example of that, of taking our leaves and food waste and chips from trees that have come down, and making compost and using that to improve our soils. I think that's good rather than going out and buying topsoil. So yeah, I can think of, yes, there are times where you might want to buy topsoil, and of course there are, if a site is being developed, you would want that topsoil and some of those other soil materials to be used and reused. But I think as much as possible, I would prefer that we keep natural soils intact, preserve our best soils, try to minimize the development impact, more, cluster developments, more reuse of existing infrastructure and development patterns, rather than using greenfields for resource extraction and sprawl development patterns. So I think we have more choices than what we typically think of. So I know it's a tough question. So any other questions from anybody? Yep. The other thing that I would say is that, when we talk about our soil resources and agriculture, is that we have such a variety of soil resources in the state. For instance, in the Connecticut River Valley, which is probably some of our where Brianna lives, correct, Brianna? You live in the Connecticut River Valley. Those soil resources, that has the highest concentration of the best farmland in the state, what we call prime farmland, statewide farmland, which is almost as good. It has some limitations of a little bit of slope or wetness. That has the highest concentration. Those are most resilient to the impacts of climate change. And the Connecticut River Valley has the longest growing season. Much of the Connecticut River Valley has a growing season of over 200 days. So to me, it would make sense to try to protect as much of that soil resources as possible. And because of the I-91 corridor and the rail line and New Haven, Hartford, and Springfield, it has a lot of development pressure. So I would like to see, more effort on protecting the best farmland and making sure that landowners know what their options are, and that municipalities understand the importance of those soil resources, not only for agriculture, but for other ecosystem services that they provide, and that we have agriculture in every town, and we have, important soil resources that are deserving of protection in every town, and where we are developing them, develop in a way where the soils can still do the things that that we ask them to do, such as recharge groundwater or serve as flood storage or wetlands, and not compromise those services.
Awesome. We have another question from Connie Mintz.
Hi, Connie.
Hi, Kip. So
Hello.
I wanted to point out that as land trusts, which sometimes own farmland, it's not only about protecting the land. It's not a one and done, but it also makes a huge difference what we allow to happen on that land. And so with the Kent Land Trust, we do protect a number of fields that are hayed. And specifically, I heard you make a reference to herbicides and pesticides. And I'm really interested to know if you could build that out a little bit more, because our hay farmer is experiencing some difficulty. You might even remember, I think we've spoken about this in the past, with Carolina horse nettle and milkweed too. Horse nettle to me seems worse than milkweed, because when I think about, pollinators.
Right.
But in any case, can you talk about herbicides and pesticides and how they relate to soil health and what you're seeing?
Sure. Yeah. So, as we're managing soil resources and as we're managing for different uses, there are consequences to the choices that we make, and that we're also in a situation too that because of globalization, that there are pests and diseases and weeds that were not here that are now here. And because of the additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that it seems that there are many weed species that particularly enjoy the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and they're more aggressive than ever before and more difficult to control. So in some cases, and depending on what your time frame is for management, in some cases, to use herbicides or pesticides of some sort that are not as toxic. It can take longer, or in some cases, you're unable to control those weeds or those pests or diseases. And that, again, depending on what your management objectives are, that to me, if, for instance, not only the horse nettle, but certainly, Japanese knotweed is another one that comes to mind, that people, and bittersweet, that people are having trouble controlling. And that if herbicides are used correctly with the minimum amount, paying attention to the physiology of the plant and the weather with a qualified applicator, I think that they can be controlled with very minimal impact on the soil biology and the soil health. And though, if you do want to manage those organically, it's going to require more persistence, and in some cases, it may require more soil disturbance. So with more soil disturbance, for instance, if it's a sloping site, there's the potential for soil erosion, and there may be more cost associated with it. So in some cases, depending on, as I said, your management, that there are other things you need to take into consideration as well. So, I think that there's also that with those additional research that we really need. And that's something that I think, as far as the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station, USDA, and UConn, that we need to push for looking at additional management strategies for some of these weeds and pests and diseases that now we're having difficulty controlling successfully, either organically or with conventional herbicides and pesticides. Okay.
Kip, can you see the chat?
Let me see if I can open up the chat.
If not, I can read a question that came in.
Sure, read it for me, please.
From Robert, one of CFT's newest board members.
Yep.
He says, Kip, given the current he says that you are amazing and a treasure to CT.
Oh, well,
So
that's very nice. Thank you, Robert.
Kip, given the current state of farmland preservation, how should we approach farm preservation for farms that are outside of the Connecticut River Valley?
Well, I think that we want to have farms in every town, in every state, from a food security standpoint, as well as all of the other kinds of, social and ecosystem goods and services they provide. So, and that we are going to be one of the few parts of the country that's going to have a climate that's suitable for people and for most forms of agriculture. So even in, the higher elevations of the Northwest or the Northeast part of the state, even though your growing season is continuing to get longer and it's going to continue to get warmer. So certainly protecting the best soil resources in those parts of the state are critical as well. And then, and I think that, not every municipality really understands the benefits of having agriculture and protecting certain soil resources. So what I would like to see is that, not only is there an additional emphasis on protecting our best farmland, but that we also look at those soils and those soil landscapes for what else they can provide, such as, maybe if you had a farm that didn't necessarily have the best soils, and though it's also part of a public water supply watershed, or it's an important recharge area, or that it's offering flood storage for a community downstream, that also be considered in our farmland preservation goals. So I don't know if that, and then the other thing is too, is that, you know, I think that making the case from a municipal standpoint that of spending the money on helping, partnering with the state or the feds or a land trust like CFT, once you've protected that farm and that landscape for perpetuity, that you've spent the money and you're receiving those benefits. But if it goes into sprawl development patterns and you know, strip malls, you're going to continue to pay for infrastructure and schools over and over again. So it's a good deal for a municipality to spend money on protecting farms and keeping farms viable and protecting the best soils.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, that isn't to say that you can't raise your hand or just jump in, but Kip has something special prepared for us.
I do,
Close out this
and I'm
webinar.
hoping that you'll all join in. Let me just get myself prepared here. Yeah.
Just let me know when you're ready, Kip, and I'll go.
Okay.
And Kip, do you need anyone to do anything, like unmute if they want?
Yes, I would say they might want to unmute,
If you're brave.
because I want to hear all of your lovely voices. So we're going to sing a song. So it can't be all gloom and doom about the state of loss of farmland and climate change. I want you to feel good about soils. I want you to be advocates for soils and to appreciate this precious and finite resource and amazing resource that we have in Connecticut, of our Connecticut soils. So if you're ready to sing, I'm going to start this. I think you all probably know this.
Can you hear? I can't hear it, Kip.
Can't hear it? The West Coast soils are hip. I really dig those crops they bear. And the Southern soils, with the way they till, they knock me out when I'm down there. The Midwest farmers' lust soils really make you feel all right. And the Northern soils, with the way they slope, to keep their orchards warm at night. I wish they all could be Connecticut. Wish they all could be Connecticut. I wish they all could be Connecticut soils. Connecticut has the sunshine and the farmers all get so tan. I dig a Paxton soil on a Drumlin hill. I dig Windsor soils in the sand. I've been all around this great big world and I've seen all kinds of soils. Yeah, but I couldn't wait to get back to the States, back to the greatest soils in the world. I wish they all could be Connecticut. I wish they all could be Connecticut. I wish they all could be Connecticut soils.
Kip, thank you for that bananas conclusion.
Thank you very much for tolerating this and for singing along. So maybe you'll be inspired to learn more about your soils, and don't treat your soils like dirt. So feel free to give me a call. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Kip.
All right, thank you so much, Kip. Thank you everyone for being here. It looks like we've covered a lot this evening. If you need to jump off, fine. I will follow up with an email that has all the resources that Kip so thoughtfully prepared And it truly was a pleasure being with you all tonight. So thank you. We do not have a webinar next Thursday, but we return on June 10th. So stay tuned and have a good night all.
Okay, thanks everybody for your attention and for tuning in. Good
Thank you,
night.
Kip.
Good night, and thank you,
Bye.
Kip.
Bye.